Commodore Vasili Arkhipov stands in the command compartment of Soviet submarine B-59, wiping sweat from his face in heat that has climbed to 135 degrees. Captain Valentin Savitsky slams his hand on the chart table and orders the weapons officer to arm the nuclear torpedo in Tube 1. Political officer Ivan Maslenikov nods agreement. Above them, American depth charges detonate in rhythmic patterns, each blast shaking the hull and rattling the gauges. The torpedo carries a 15-kiloton warhead, equivalent to the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, and the outer door is already open. Arkhipov steps forward and says he does not concur. Savitsky turns, his face flushed, and demands to know whether the Commodore's vote is even required. Earlier that week, October 27, 1962. Soviet submarine B-59 runs submerged south of Cuba, part of a 4-boat flotilla ordered to establish a forward base near Mariel. The diesel-electric Foxtrot-class boat carries 78 men, 22 torpedoes, and one weapon that sets it apart: a nuclear-tipped T-5 torpedo locked in Tube 1. Commodore Vasili Arkhipov is aboard as flotilla commander, but he holds no direct operational control of the boat. Captain Savitsky commands the vessel. Political officer Maslenikov holds the second key for weapons release under standard Soviet two-man doctrine. Diesel submarines must snorkel every few hours to recharge batteries and pull in fresh air. B-59 has been submerged for over 24 hours straight to avoid U.S. Navy surface ships patrolling the quarantine line. Interior temperature climbs past 100 degrees as the cooling system struggles under the load. Men rotate through the few bunks in shifts, and the medical officer rations carbon dioxide absorbent cartridges to stretch supplies. The boat's high-frequency radio antennas must break the surface to receive messages from Northern Fleet headquarters, but American destroyers make that impossible. The crew operates under standing war orders issued before departure. If you cannot communicate with headquarters and you come under attack, assume hostilities have begun and execute retaliation protocols. The logic is straightforward. A nuclear war might start and end in hours, so waiting for confirmation could mean waiting until Soviet territory is already destroyed. Captain Savitsky reviews the orders with his officers in the wardroom, reminding them that the nuclear torpedo exists precisely for this scenario. Arkhipov listens but says nothing, his face unreadable in the yellow glow of the overhead bulbs. Arkhipov meets with the engineering officer in the battery compartment to review fuel and power reserves. The boat has enough diesel to run surfaced for another week, but submerged endurance depends entirely on the battery bank. At current drain, they have roughly 24 hours of charge remaining before the boat must either surface or go dead in the water. Surfacing means detection and likely confrontation with American destroyers. Staying submerged means suffocation if the batteries die before they can blow ballast. Either way, the clock is running, and neither officer sees a third option. 3 days pass without a single message from Moscow. Every few hours, the radio operator climbs into the conning tower and listens on the high-frequency bands. But all he hears is American voice traffic and the occasional burst of encrypted teletype. Northern Fleet broadcasts its scheduled updates at fixed times each day, and B-59 has missed 12 consecutive transmission windows. The crew begins to speculate. Some think the Americans are jamming Soviet frequencies. Others wonder if the war has already started and Fleet headquarters no longer exists to transmit. Captain Valentin Savitsky has commanded B-59 for 2 years. He is a submarine veteran, decisive under pressure, and known for aggressive tactics during training exercises. Political officer Ivan Maslenikov is responsible for ideological compliance and crew morale, but he also holds the second key required to authorize nuclear weapons release under standard Soviet doctrine. Commodore Vasili Arkhipov commands the flotilla, not this boat, and his presence aboard is partly bureaucratic accident. The flotilla flagship suffered mechanical trouble before departure, so Arkhipov transferred to B-59. His formal authority over Savitsky is clear in port, but undefined during combat operations at sea. On the 4th day submerged, the cooling system begins to fail. Seawater pumps that normally chill the diesel generators and battery compartment lose pressure, and interior temperatures climb past 110 degrees in the forward compartments. Men strip to their underwear and splash themselves with drinking water to stay conscious. The medical officer reports the first case of heat exhaustion, a machinist who collapsed in the engine room and had to be dragged to a bunk near a ventilation duct. Carbon dioxide levels rise as the scrubber cartridges saturate, and crew members start showing signs of impaired judgment, short tempers, and slow reaction times. U.S. Navy destroyers detect B-59 on sonar and begin dropping practice depth charges. Small explosive signals intended to force the submarine to surface and identify itself. Under the quarantine protocol, the charges are hand grenade-sized, designed to be audible but non-lethal, a signaling method the U.S. Navy has used for years. But Soviet submariners have not been briefed on this procedure. Inside the hull, the explosions sound identical to live anti-submarine grenades. Each detonation hammers the steel plating, and crew members brace against bulkheads, certain they are under attack. Captain Savitsky orders the boat deeper and increases speed to evade. In the command compartment, Savitsky and Maslenikov review the situation. No contact with Moscow for 4 days. Repeated explosions overhead. American destroyers actively hunting them. The captain pulls out the standing war orders and reads the relevant section aloud. If unable to communicate and under attack, assume hostilities have begun. Maslenikov agrees. The depth charges fit the profile of an anti-submarine attack, and the lack of radio contact means they cannot confirm whether the crisis has escalated to open war. Both officers conclude that World War III has likely started, and that their orders require retaliation against the American surface group. The engineering officer reports, battery charge has dropped to 20%. Running at evasive speed drains power faster than anticipated, and the boat now has less than 12 hours of submerged endurance remaining. Savitsky faces a choice: slow down and risk being pinned by the American destroyers until the batteries die, or surface immediately and accept whatever consequences follow. Surfacing while under attack, he reasons, will likely result in the boat being sunk by gunfire or torpedoed. If the war has started, surrendering means losing the only Soviet asset in the region capable of striking back. The captain orders the boat to continue evasive maneuvers. Interior temperature in the command compartment hits 135 degrees. Men can no longer stand for more than a few minutes without dizziness. The medical officer warns that sustained heat above 130 degrees causes cognitive impairment, slower problem solving, increased aggression, and difficulty weighing long-term consequences. Carbon dioxide concentration approaches the threshold for acute poisoning, and several crew members lie unconscious in the torpedo room, where the air is slightly cooler. Captain Savitsky's uniform is soaked through, and his hands shake as he grips the periscope handles. Arkhipov stands near the chart table, pale and breathing in shallow gasps, but still upright. Soviet fleet doctrine for nuclear weapons release is straightforward. The captain and the political officer each hold a key. Both must agree to authorize launch, and both must turn their keys simultaneously at the firing console. The system is designed for boats operating beyond radio range, where waiting for Moscow's approval might mean waiting until the war is over. The protocol assumes that two officers together will make a more rational decision than one, and that the political officer will restrain a reckless captain or spur a hesitant one. Aboard B-59, Captain Savitsky and political officer Maslenikov have already drilled this procedure 3 times during the patrol. An obscure addendum to the standard protocol exists for submarines carrying a flotilla commander or other flag officer. If a senior officer is embarked, the regulation states that all 3 must concur before nuclear weapons may be released. The rule was written to prevent a boat captain from launching without higher authority, but it has never been tested in combat, and most submarine crews are unaware it exists. Captain Savitsky knows the regulation, but he has never drilled it and does not know whether it applies when the flotilla commander is aboard as a passenger rather than in operational command. Arkhipov's legal authority at this moment is genuinely unclear. Vasili Arkhipov is not aboard by chance. 16 months earlier, in July 1961, he served as executive officer aboard submarine K-19, when its nuclear reactor lost cooling during a training mission. The crew improvised a repair using spare piping while exposed to lethal radiation, and Arkhipov helped organize the effort that saved the boat but killed 8 men within weeks. The experience left him cautious about worst-case assumptions and deeply skeptical of orders to act without confirmation. Captain Savitsky knows this history, and it colors his view of the Commodore's judgment. Savitsky respects Arkhipov's rank, but suspects he is overly cautious, perhaps even traumatized. On the surface, the U.S. Navy destroyer group maintains sonar contact and continues the depth charge pattern. The American commanders know a Soviet submarine is below, but have no idea it carries a nuclear weapon. They assume it is a conventional diesel boat gathering intelligence, and their orders are to force it to surface for identification under the quarantine rules, not to sink it. The destroyers drop charges at regular intervals, methodically boxing in the submarine's possible escape routes. The American sonar operators hear the Soviet boat speeding up and slowing down erratically, a sign of evasion. But they interpret it as routine cat-and-mouse tactics, not the prelude to a nuclear launch decision. Another pattern of depth charges detonates directly above the hull, closer than before. The entire boat shudders and the lights flicker. A hydraulic line ruptures in the stern, spraying fluid across the engine room, and the plainsman reports loss of pressure in the aft diving planes. The boat begins to sink bow up, and crew members scramble to shift ballast forward. One charge detonates so close that it feels like a hammer blow against the outer hull plating, and for 5 seconds every man aboard believes the hull is about to rupture. In the command compartment, Captain Savitsky grips the periscope stand and steadies himself, his face flushed dark red. Captain Savitsky slams his hand on the chart table and shouts at the weapons officer. "Arm the special weapon in Tube 1. We are going to blast them now. They will not humiliate us." Political officer Maslenikov steps forward immediately and concurs, citing the standing war orders. No communication for 4 days, repeated attack, and the boat is dying. The weapons officer moves to the firing console and begins the arming sequence. He opens the outer door on Tube 1, floods the tube, and spins up the torpedo's gyroscope. The nuclear warhead initialization takes 90 seconds. Green lights appear on the console, one by one, as each safety interlock disengages. Commodore Arkhipov steps forward and places his hand on the weapons officer's shoulder. He does not raise his voice. He simply states that he does not concur with the launch order and that the flotilla commander's vote is required under the 3-man protocol. Savitsky wheels around and demands to know by what authority the Commodore presumes to override operational command. Arkhipov replies that the regulation is explicit. If a flag officer is embarked, all 3 must agree. Maslenikov looks between the 2 men, uncertain. The weapons officer's hand hovers over the firing key, waiting for resolution. The green lights continue to glow. Savitsky argues that Arkhipov holds no operational command of B-59. The Commodore is aboard as a passenger because the flotilla flagship broke down before departure. During combat operations, the boat's captain has sole tactical authority, and the political officer provides the second vote as a check on rash decisions. Arkhipov's rank is administrative, not operational in this scenario. Arkhipov counters that the 3-man rule exists precisely to prevent 2 panicked officers from launching when communication is lost. The regulation makes no distinction between operational and administrative authority. It simply requires the flotilla commander to concur. Savitsky has no answer because no one in the command compartment can cite the exact wording. Arkhipov makes a different argument. He points out that the depth charges are too small to be anti-submarine grenades. If the Americans intended to sink the boat, they would use full-sized weapons or torpedoes. The pattern is consistent with signaling, not attack. More importantly, if World War III has started, why are the American destroyers still dropping small charges instead of launching a coordinated strike? Savitsky counters that the Americans may be toying with them, or that the fleet is waiting for authorization to use lethal weapons. Arkhipov asks how Moscow can authorize retaliation if they cannot even confirm the war has started. Silence follows. The weapons officer stands at the firing panel, his hand resting on the firing key. The torpedo in Tube 1 is fully armed. The outer door is open. The gyroscope is spun up, and the warhead initialization sequence is complete. All that remains is the final firing command, which requires 2 officers to turn their keys simultaneously and then the weapons officer to press the red firing button. He looks at Captain Savitsky, then at Commodore Arkhipov, then back at the console. His training tells him to wait for unanimous agreement, but the captain has given a direct order, and the Commodore's authority is unclear. He does not know what to do. The command compartment goes silent except for the hum of the ventilation fans and the distant thud of another depth charge. All 3 officers stare at the torpedo firing console. Savitsky's hand is halfway to his key. Maslenikov has his key in hand, ready to turn it. Arkhipov stands with his arms crossed, unmoving. 30 seconds pass. The weapons officer shifts his weight from one foot to the other, waiting. No one speaks. The heat presses down, and the air smells of sweat, diesel fuel, and hot metal. This is the moment. Someone must give way, or the question will resolve itself when the batteries die and the Americans decide what to do. The weapon in Tube 1 is a T-5 torpedo, a standard Soviet anti-ship design modified to carry a nuclear warhead. It weighs approximately 5,000 pounds, runs at 30 knots, and has a range of roughly 10 kilometers. The warhead yield is 15 kilotons, equivalent to the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The weapon is designed to destroy an entire carrier battle group with a single underwater detonation. When fired, the torpedo runs straight and level for its programmed distance, then detonates at a preset depth beneath the surface. The blast creates a massive steam cavity that collapses inward, generating a shockwave powerful enough to break the keel of any ship within a mile. A 15-kiloton nuclear explosion underwater is fundamentally different from an airburst. The warhead detonates at a depth of roughly 100 feet, creating a fireball that instantly vaporizes thousands of tons of seawater. The fireball expands into a gas bubble that rises toward the surface, pushing a column of superheated steam and radioactive water upward at hundreds of feet per second. When the column breaches the surface, it erupts into a geyser over 1,000 feet tall, visible for 50 miles. The shockwave radiates outward through the water, far more efficiently than through air, crushing any hull within a mile radius and causing fatal damage to ships as far as 2 miles away. U.S. Navy carrier groups operate under standing orders to interpret any nuclear detonation as a strategic first strike. The doctrine assumes that if a Soviet submarine launches a nuclear weapon, it is either acting on orders from Moscow or has concluded that World War III has already started. Either interpretation requires immediate retaliation. Theater commanders do not wait for presidential authorization in this scenario because communication delays could allow follow-on Soviet strikes to destroy additional assets. Automatic response protocols trigger within minutes. Carrier-based aircraft launch with nuclear depth charges. Ballistic missile submarines receive execute orders for strikes against Soviet naval bases. The chain reaction is designed to be irreversible once the first weapon detonates. Once American forces launch nuclear depth charges in retaliation, the Soviet Navy interprets the strikes as confirmation that war has begun. Remaining Soviet submarines in the Atlantic fire their nuclear torpedoes at NATO shipping lanes. Soviet bomber bases in the Arctic scramble their fleets toward North America. American early warning radar picks up the bomber formations and triggers alerts at Strategic Air Command. Strategic bombers and ICBMs go to launch-ready status. At that point, both sides face a choice: launch everything before the other side destroys your assets, or wait and risk losing the ability to retaliate. History and doctrine suggest both sides launch. The entire sequence, from B-59's torpedo detonation to full strategic exchange, takes less than 6 hours. The standard Soviet two-man protocol for nuclear weapons release was designed to balance speed and caution. A single officer might launch impulsively or hesitate fatally. 2 officers together are assumed to make a better decision. The captain provides tactical judgment, and the political officer provides ideological oversight and a check on rash action. The system works well for boats in contact with headquarters, where ambiguous situations can be clarified by radio. But for submarines operating independently, beyond communication range, the two-man rule becomes a blunt instrument. It assumes two officers will interpret incomplete information the same way, and it provides no mechanism for resolving disagreement when both believe they are following doctrine correctly. The three-man rule was added as an afterthought when the Soviet Navy realized some submarines would carry flotilla commanders or other flag officers. The addendum states that if a senior officer is embarked, that officer must also concur before nuclear weapons may be released. The intent was to ensure higher authority could veto a rash launch, but the regulation does not specify what happens during combat operations when the flotilla commander holds no operational command of the boat. Does the Commodore's vote remain mandatory, or does it become advisory when the boat is under attack and the captain must make tactical decisions in seconds? The regulation simply does not say, and no one anticipated that the ambiguity would matter. Soviet submarine crews drilled the two-man protocol repeatedly during training, but the three-man variant was almost never practiced. Flotilla commanders rarely rowed aboard boats during operational patrols, and when they did, the boat stayed in communication with headquarters, so the question of independent launch authority did not arise. B-59's situation is unique. A flotilla commander aboard a boat he does not command, under sustained attack, with no radio contact, and facing a launch decision based on worst-case assumptions. No training scenario anticipated this combination, and no drill prepared the crew to resolve the legal conflict between Savitsky's operational command and Arkhipov's regulatory veto. The crew is improvising institutional procedure in real time under conditions of heat exhaustion and oxygen deprivation. The weapons officer breaks the silence. He asks Captain Savitsky for final confirmation to fire. His voice is hoarse from dehydration, and his hand trembles slightly on the firing key. Savitsky looks at the console, then at Commodore Arkhipov, then at political officer Maslenikov. He does not speak immediately. Another death charge detonates overhead, and the deck tilts as the boat loses trim. The engineering officer shouts that battery charge is down to 15%, and they have perhaps 8 hours remaining before the boat loses all power and sinks. Savitsky's jaw tightens and his hand moves toward his firing key. Arkhipov does not move. He stands with his arms crossed, his face pale and slick with sweat, but his expression is calm. He states quietly that he will not concur with the launch order, and that the flotilla commander's refusal makes the launch illegal under any interpretation of the three-man regulation. Savitsky shouts that the boat is under attack, and that waiting for Moscow's clarification means death or capture. Arkhipov replies that surfacing and surrendering is preferable to starting a nuclear war based on a guess. His voice is steady, almost emotionless, as if he is reading from a manual rather than arguing for his life. Political officer Ivan Maslenikov steps between Savitsky and Arkhipov. He tells Savitsky that if they launch the torpedo without the Commodore's vote, and the war turns out not to have started, the Navy will court-martial all three of them. The regulations are explicit enough that a tribunal will conclude they violated procedure, regardless of the combat circumstances. Maslenikov's fear is not moral, but institutional. He believes they will be punished for guessing wrong, and the ambiguity of the three-man rule will not protect them. Savitsky stares at him for a long moment, then looks back at the firing console. Captain Savitsky stands frozen at the chart table for 10 seconds. His hand hovers over his firing key. He looks at the weapons officer, at the glowing console, at Arkhipov, at Maslenikov. He closes his eyes briefly, breathing hard. Then he steps back from the console and orders the weapons officer to safe the torpedo and close the outer door on Tube 1. His voice is flat, drained of emotion. The weapons officer flips the switches and the green lights blink off one by one. The command compartment remains silent except for the sound of hydraulic actuators closing the torpedo tube door. Savitsky announces the boat will attempt to surface and establish radio contact with Northern Fleet headquarters. The decision accepts the risk of American capture or destruction by gunfire if the war has in fact begun, but it is the only option remaining. The batteries cannot sustain submerged operations past midnight, and the crew is approaching the limit of heat endurance. He orders the plainsmen to begin a slow ascent and to prepare to blow ballast tanks on his command. Crew members brace against bulkheads, uncertain whether they are rising toward rescue or into a barrage of gunfire. Arkhipov stands silently near the chart table, his face unreadable. B-59 rises slowly through 300 feet, then 200, then 100. The plainsman calls out depth readings every 20 feet, and the crew listens for the sound of torpedo motors or the sudden detonation that would mean an American attack. The depth charges have stopped, but no one knows whether that is a good sign or simply a pause before lethal force. At 50 feet, Savitsky orders the boat to periscope depth and raises the search periscope. He scans the horizon and sees the silhouettes of American destroyers in a loose circle around the submarine. Their guns are trained on the water, but no one is firing. He lowers the periscope and orders the boat to surface fully. B-59 breaks the surface at 8:53 p.m. on October 27, 1962. The conning tower emerges into the warm Caribbean night and seawater streams off the hull. Captain Savitsky climbs the ladder to the bridge, followed by the watch officer and a signalman. American destroyer searchlights snap on, illuminating the submarine in harsh white light. The destroyers train their 5-inch guns on the conning tower, but do not fire. Savitsky orders the signalman to radio the boat's identification and request for safe passage. The message goes out in Russian and broken English, and the crew waits for the American response, still uncertain whether they have surfaced into peace or war. The American destroyers do not fire. They maintain their positions and continue to track the submarine with searchlights and radar, but they make no hostile moves. Hours later, B-59 establishes radio contact with Northern Fleet headquarters on high-frequency channels. The message from Moscow is brief. The quarantine remains in effect, but no state of war exists between the Soviet Union and the United States. The depth charges were signaling devices, not attacks. The submarine is ordered to return to base immediately. Captain Savitsky acknowledges the transmission and begins plotting a course back across the Atlantic. The crew learns they were never under attack. B-59 returns to the Soviet naval base at Murmansk in early November. Captain Savitsky, political officer Maslenikov, and Commodore Arkhipov are all summoned to fleet headquarters and reprimanded for failing to maintain covert patrol and for allowing environmental conditions aboard the boat to degrade crew effectiveness. No official report mentions the nuclear torpedo or the near launch. The incident is classified, and the 3 officers are forbidden to discuss it. Savitsky is reassigned to a training command. Arkhipov returns to flotilla duty. The crew of B-59 is dispersed to other boats, and the submarine itself is placed in overhaul for 6 months. 6 months later, Soviet fleet regulations are quietly updated. The 3-man rule is clarified in explicit language. If a flotilla commander or flag officer is embarked on a submarine carrying nuclear weapons, that officer's concurrence is mandatory and binding for any launch decision, regardless of whether the officer holds operational command of the boat. The regulation further specifies that in the event of disagreement, the senior officer's veto cannot be overridden by the boat captain or political officer. The change is distributed to all submarine commands without explanation. No reference is made to B-59 or the events of October 1962. American intelligence agencies do not learn that B-59 carried a nuclear torpedo until October 2002, during a conference in Havana, marking the 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Former Soviet officers attend the conference and disclose for the first time that 4 submarines in the flotilla each carried 1 nuclear-tipped torpedo, and that B-59 came within minutes of launching its weapon. American participants, including former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, are stunned. The revelation fundamentally changes historians' understanding of how close the world came to nuclear war during the crisis. Until that conference, American officials believed the quarantine involved only conventional forces. Vasili Arkhipov never publicly discusses the B-59 incident. He continues his naval career, rising to the rank of Rear Admiral before retiring in 1980. He returns to civilian life in Moscow and lives quietly with his family. He dies in 1998 at the age of 72, largely unknown outside naval circles. His widow, Olga Arkhipova, later tells interviewers that Arkhipov rarely spoke about his service and never claimed credit for preventing a war. He viewed his refusal to concur with a launch order as a procedural decision, not a moral one, and believed he was simply following the regulations as written. Captain Valentin Savitsky continues his naval career after the B-59 incident, but he is never again given command of a frontline submarine. He serves in training and staff positions until his retirement in the mid-1970s. Soviet naval records released after the Cold War show that Savitsky filed a formal complaint against Arkhipov in late 1962, arguing that the Commodore overstepped his authority and that the three-man rule should not apply during combat operations. The complaint is rejected by Fleet Headquarters, and the updated regulation in 1963 implicitly sides with Arkhipov's interpretation. Savitsky never speaks publicly about the incident and dies in the 1990s. The three-man rule becomes standard procedure for all Soviet and later Russian submarines carrying nuclear weapons. The 1963 regulation clarifying mandatory concurrence remains in force today, explicitly designed to prevent launch during communication failures. Russian submarine commanders still drill the three-officer protocol, and the scenario of a flotilla commander vetoing a captain's launch order is now a standard training exercise. The legacy is institutional rather than personal. The near launch aboard B-59 revealed that procedural safeguards are only effective when their language is unambiguous, and the Soviet Navy corrected that ambiguity within months. The correction likely prevented similar crises in later years. The B-59 incident reveals a paradox. The three-man rule existed because someone in the Soviet naval bureaucracy anticipated that a flotilla commander's presence might require an additional check on nuclear launch authority. But the same bureaucracy failed to clarify the rule's application during combat, and no one thought to drill the scenario before it happened in the field. The result was institutional luck rather than institutional design. The rule was strong enough to give Arkhipov leverage, but ambiguous enough that Savitsky could have ignored it. The Torpedo did not launch because Maslenikov feared a court-martial, not because the regulation was clear. Institutional safeguards, it turns out, are only as strong as their worst-case interpretation. If Captain Savitsky and political officer Maslenikov had overridden Arkhipov's veto, or if Arkhipov had not been aboard at all, the T-5 torpedo would have launched at the American destroyer group. The 15-kiloton warhead would have detonated beneath the USS Coney or USS Murray, destroying both ships and likely damaging or sinking several others. Within minutes, U.S. carrier-based aircraft would have launched nuclear depth charges against B-59 and the other Soviet submarines in the area. Within hours, Soviet bomber bases would have scrambled their fleets, and American strategic forces would have gone to full alert. Historical simulations suggest the exchange would have escalated to full strategic war within 12 hours, with casualties in the hundreds of millions. In the years following the 2002 Havana Conference, historians and journalists begin to recognize Arkhipov's role in preventing nuclear war. He is posthumously credited by the National Security Archive and other organizations as the man who saved the world, though many scholars point out that the credit belongs as much to the regulation itself and to Maslenikov's institutional fear as to any individual decision. Arkhipov's widow, Olga, tells interviewers her husband would have been uncomfortable with the hero narrative. He believed he was simply doing his job and following procedure. The story becomes a case study in nuclear command and control courses, illustrating both the value of institutional checks and the danger of ambiguous authority. The lesson of B-59 is not that one man saved the world. It is that unclear procedures almost destroyed it. The three-man rule existed, but its ambiguous wording allowed Captain Savitsky to argue he could ignore it. The regulation was updated only after the crisis, which means the institutional learning happened in retrospect rather than in advance. If Commodore Arkhipov had not been aboard, or if political officer Maslenikov had sided with Savitsky, the rule would have failed. The torpedo did not launch because three factors converged: a regulation that was just strong enough, an officer willing to invoke it, and a political officer afraid of punishment. History turned on the weakest link holding, not the strongest link working as designed. That, in the end, is the paradox of institutional safeguards under pressure.